So there were some things that you wanted to, some concerns, or you wanted to clarify with our story. Talk to me.
Sure, Tarik. Yeah, and concerns is probably a harsh word. I think what I wanted was just an opportunity to respond and give your viewers an opportunity to just get our point of view. A couple things to address, because I think that the story was around neighborhood investments and capital infrastructure and maybe attempting to assign some definitions to those things. And that positioned against the Lot J development that the City Council is currently considering. Something to note, and I think the mayor clarified this, and perhaps it was the morning show or whatever the previous show was he did, but since we've come into office and when we first got in, there was virtually no capital infrastructure budget. It was operational budgets year in and year out. And when the mayor came in, addressed pension reform, it freed up some capital in current years that we could start dealing with some of the backlog of neighborhood infrastructure. So since we've been in, over $500 million in neighborhood investments and capital infrastructure in every single neighborhood around our county. And those budgets will continue until we leave office. Obviously, there was a tremendous backlog in terms of infrastructure. So the mayor's approached this in two ways. One, before you tackle big developments like this or one-off developments like this, you need to start catching up on what that backlog looks like, and hence that's the $500 million we've invested so far. And you have to set up a pathway that continues to do that. So when we approach our capital infrastructure plans, those are 5-year plans. So there are things within that budget that are going to happen after Mayor Curry leaves office. And so we've set up a trajectory that we continue to invest in neighborhoods even after we leave office. But it also, we're balancing that against, we have some serious momentum in our downtown, and we'd like to capture that with the opportunity we have with the Jaguars and Cordish.
I think you bring up a good point about what is the definition of a neighborhood infrastructure plan. I mean, if you go to Ken Knight Drive and ask them what's your definition of neighborhood infrastructure, they might have a different opinion than someone who lives on the south side near the St. John's Town Center. So,
of course,
there were some line items that you thought should have been included. What do we miss? The mayor said close to $200 million in infrastructure. We came up with the number 145.
Sure.
Which wasn't that far off.
Right.
Is there anything additional that needs to be added to make sure that to add to the, I guess, the accuracy, not the truth, but the accuracy of the mayor's statement of $200 million?
Sure. And the definition of capital improvements or capital infrastructure is defined in our ordinance code. Right. Or a neighborhood investment. Right. Look, if you go out into the community and you have discussions the way the mayor has had, many of them view putting in new fire stations and rehabbing old ones as neighborhood investments. And the reason for that is, one, property values go up. And reason two, there are elements in our community, you mentioned the south side, there are neighborhoods over there that the mayor was able to reduce their home insurance premiums by 25% by putting in a fire station or a public safety aspect closer to their homes. So when we look at the definition of neighborhood investments, is it benefiting the neighbors around the area or the neighborhood or community at large? And I believe that the $200 million the mayor addressed gets to that. And you had a person described as an expert that pulled out some things, and that could or could not be the position of your newsroom. But look, we view everything on that item as it does one of two things. It's enhancing property values, or it's benefiting quality of life for neighbors around the area. You look at UF Health. That's $20 million a year in backlog infrastructure that hospital's needed forever. And that hospital serves our uninsured population for the city. So when we look at, is this a neighborhood investment or a community investment? Absolutely. Fire stations, lowering home insurance premiums, increasing property values, those are absolutely neighborhood investments.
What about the Florida Theater and the Jacksonville Zoo?
Sure, this very same position. Those are community assets, and they do benefit the neighborhood. I think the response we had to the news organization is downtown is a neighborhood. Downtown's been neglected for a very long time. When we came in, virtually nothing over the past few decades in our downtown had changed. Since then, we are investing in the neighborhood. We're investing in community-owned assets. The things that you just referenced, the zoo, the city of Jacksonville and the community and the taxpayers own that facility. And I think that our assets need to continue to be invested in.
Two things. I want to have another question before we get too far ahead in the interview. I want to go back to, you said it again, the same thing the mayor said, was that the previous administration only invested so-and-so million. Do you think it's fair to talk about the previous administration when they were coming out of the 2008 recession. I mean, the money that the city had in 2008, when I guess was Alvin Brown was in office, was nowhere in comparison to I mean, the entire country was struggling. Is that a fair comparison, or even to bring up the previous administration?
Sure, and that commentary was not meant to be a disparaging comment towards the prior administration. John Payton was in office towards the end of that. Alvin Brown took office in 2011 through 2015. Mm-hmm. What I'm pointing out is budgets are about priorities. And a priority of this administration, the mayor campaigned on it in 2015, campaigned on it again in 2019, is a promise to address infrastructure spending. The mayor came in and immediately tackled a pension reform issue. That freed up capital. That took political will. The mayor went to Tallahassee, went to the voters of the county to repurpose the tax years out so that we could free up some spending currently to invest in our neighborhoods. So in terms of comparison, the budgets and priorities of the prior administrations are what they were. And this reflect the priorities that the mayor took to the voters several times.
Okay. Are there any other line by lines that you wanted to either dispute or add? I mean, we still sticking to the nearly $200 million in neighborhood infrastructure investments?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think the 200 million is a legitimate number. I think if you go through all of those projects, I'd be happy to have the debate on what's a neighborhood investment or not. But the individual specifically referenced the public safety elements of those and public facilities. Right. If you go to those neighborhoods and you talk to or you talk to the neighbors that are over there, they're going to agree that those are much needed community investments or neighborhood investments.
I don't want to get too much into the weeds going line by line, but I mean, ash remediation, isn't that the result of a lawsuit? I know that there were. Would you say that was correct for us to include that in our elimination from the mayor's $200 million?
Look, if the debate is whether environmental remediation that we're required to do to provide safe and developable public space is not a neighborhood enhancement, I'm not sure what is. We need to clean up our property so that it's safe for the citizens of Jacksonville.
You did include, and I will agree with you, on the fire stations, the fire departments. So, we can, there's $40 million there that we cited.
Sure.
But I guess a good portion of that could be some of that. We spent some time on the north side today in the Christabel neighborhood talking to some of the people there. Mm-hmm. Septic tanks were promised back in 1968 consolidation. A lot of them are like, well, the city's finding $220, $30, whatever million to complete a job at Lot J.
Sure.
They feel neglected. They feel as if this is a more than a 50-year-old promise that's from the city, and they say, this isn't fair. What's your response to those people?
Look, those are legitimate concerns, and the septic tank issue is a decade-old issue and will be a decade-long issue. When the mayor came in, he established the first ever real attempt to start chipping away at that issue. Immediately right out of the gate, $15 million from the city of Jacksonville out of our budget, $15 million in partnership with JEA. Since then, there's been an additional $15 million committed from JEA. The work's beginning on that process, but obviously that's $45 million of a $1 billion problem. And it's a legitimate point, which is why just earlier this year we worked with Councilmember Carlucci to codify in our ordinance what infrastructure spending should look like in neighborhoods. Septic tanks are one of those issues. And the mayor's been in conversations with Councilwoman Priestley Jackson out of the new year how to address a long-term solution to that, past the money that we've already committed. But absolutely, but it's a community-wide issue. It's not just on the north side. It's all over the city of Jacksonville. There are elements of San Marco and Mandarin that still have septic tank issues. Those need to be addressed. The mayor's outlined a neighborhood priority list. The neighborhood you referenced is at the very top of that list.
But there's no money for that neighborhood left. It's all spent. So what's next for them?
Sure. Again, budgets reflect priorities of this administration. I suspect in the next year or so, we'll be looking at an element or a long-term solution on how to deal with that.
You realize those people have been hearing that for the past 50 plus years.
I understand. The mayor, again, the commitment from the mayor is immediately upon taking office, he immediately invested in that and set up and actually prioritized those neighborhoods that dealt with socioeconomic issues, they dealt with environmental issues or proximity to our waterways, and how you fund them in the order that you fund them in, and creating a funding source that starts the conversation on that.
I'm going to ask you one more question on that, and then I'll leave that alone. How could you find money to do Lot J, but you can't find the money to fix a problem that's 60 plus years old?
Sure, and I would pivot back to what the mayor told the morning show or whatever it was he did last week. Budgets reflect priorities, and downtown development is a priority of the mayor, and so is infrastructure. And again, we inherited a major backlog in infrastructure projects. We're $500 million in. We have been spending and showing the mayor's commitment to neighborhoods. We also made a promise on downtown development. Downtown serves as an economic engine for the entire city. If our downtown's performing well economically, it's going to benefit the city. It's going to generate more taxes that we can spend on what the mayor's addressed as a priority in all of his budgets, neighborhood investments.
Some people are going to hear that and say, well, I'm not a priority then. If I live on the north side, my septic tank is not a priority if the other priorities are downtown revitalization.
I think what I just explained to you was both of them are priorities of the mayor. He spent it aggressively in both of them, and our budgets reflect that. And septic tanks are an issue, but I think the city understands that that's a multi-billion-dollar issue that we need a long-term solution for. We've started the conversation, how to fund, and the way at which that money gets pushed out in a kind of a pecking order on when you address those specific neighborhoods. And obviously we have to have a conversation around a major funding solution with the city council.
Okay, let's move to Lot J.
Okay.
Will the delay of Lot J until January create problems?
Look, from the beginning of the Lot J conversation that started with council members almost 16 months ago when we rolled out the initial term sheet, 90% of those business points remain the same. Our point has always been, let's get all of the questions of the city council staff answered. And once that point arrives, it's time for a policy position. The job of the administration is to negotiate a deal. Approving it belongs in the hands of city council. They're going to take the time necessary to evaluate that deal, but they should be considerate to the fact that once they get their questions answered, it's time for a policy position. And I think the majority of them are there.
Tommy Hazoria said he has provided a pathway to get all those questions answered. Do you believe that all the questions concerning Lot J have been answered?
Look, I think most of them have. And I think that there are one or two council members that we continue to work with. We worked through the weekend. I actually just left a meeting, as well as tardy to this meeting. We just left a meeting with one of them. But there have been several public meetings with opportunities for city council members to ask questions for hours. Unfortunately, as your news station's covered, some of those meetings were less than productive and council members weren't afforded the opportunity. So they rely on one-on-one meetings between the administration and the development team to get those. We've spent over 30 hours with their council staff to address their concerns. I think there's a pathway that city council can feel completely comfortable supporting a deal before the year's out, but ultimately we don't control the legislative timeline, the council president does. So I know he's trying to act in the best interest of his body, but I think the majority of them will be ready to stake a position before the year's out.
What do you think the administration's biggest concern is if Lot J is voted down?
Look, it's the message that it sends to the development community. It's a legitimate conversation to have a policy discussion on, do we want to spend this amount of money to spark development in that area of our downtown? The mayor's position is it does. City council has to make that position, but it does send a pretty big signal. I think the mayor alluded to a couple of months ago when we first rolled this out. Development interests, both locally, nationally, and globally, are watching what we're doing right now. And we're either going to be a bold city that tackles development and shows we have capacity to have an NFL team, shows we have capacity to be a great downtown, and this is a decision point for that.
Do you think the JEA dilemma is making it difficult for council to trust the administration? And how can you reassure them that the JEA dilemma should not have an impact?
Sure. The majority of them, I don't think it's impacting the decision. Obviously, that's a very public conversation that individuals are still having. But what I would say that the difference in this and Tarik is that council's been involved from the very beginning, and is because this was the city administration negotiating a deal as opposed to an independent authority. So what we have now is a very public conversation, a very public negotiation that council has been participating in for 2 months. So they are very much involved in this. They weren't tremendously involved in the prior, the JEA endeavor. They're involved in this. All of their considerations are being taken in, many of which have been incorporated into the legislation. So This is very much a team effort between the administration, city council, and a development team that want to do what's best for Jacksonville. So I think that's the main difference there, is they're very much engaged and involved with the administration intimately in this deal.
Okay. The mayor made the statement that there was almost $200 million in infrastructure investments. Why isn't he here to respond to it now?
Sure. Again, the mayor did an interview with you guys prior that prompted this story. He's given quotations that were in response to your story. I wish the mayor would have been contacted to do maybe some on-camera in response to the story you guys ran. This is short notice, so I'm here to speak on his behalf. I hope that I was able to adequately answer your questions, but obviously the mayor would love to address them if you want to provide another opportunity. But I believe that the opportunity to provide his input would have been when you ran the story this weekend. But I appreciate the opportunity to address it now.
Absolutely.